Instantaneous discs are designed to be recorded on the spot, and they are predominantly a non-commercial format. And the non-commercial format means that they were designed specifically for the user to use. In this case, it might be an individual who is trying to preserve it for themselves, or it might be a radio station or a radio network trying to preserve it for archival purposes, or even rebroadcast purposes. An instantaneous recording needs special care both for the disc and for the playback, primarily because if you damage it, you don't get another chance, because these recordings tend to be unique. If the substrate is metal, it's usually aluminum, and the aluminum will probably last a long time. Aluminum doesn't rust. But the material on top of the metal, the lacquer, can dry out and crack, or can deteriorate into a material called palmitic acid. And palmitic acid is a whitening of the groove in which the groove is literally deteriorating. Getting back to material again, some discs, usually those made during the Second World War, were on a glass base. If the disc, which should have been originally black, it looks like it has this whitish film on it. As I said, that's called palmitic acid, and that's a deterioration of the top layer of the disc, which is called lacquer or acetate. And what you do is you give it basically a mineral oil bath, and then you use a very sophisticated device called the Keith Monk's machine to clean off the disc, wash the disc, and then let it air dry. Once you've cleaned the palmitic acid off the disc, you have a clock ticking, because the disc most likely will deteriorate again, and again most likely at a faster rate. Now this clock ticking isn't very fast. You may have as much as a year, but you don't know. So what you want to do is clean the palmitic acid off it, and then after you've dried it and cleaned it with the Keith Monk's machine and then dried it further by air drying it, sometime that day or the next day you want to transfer the disc. And very often much of the surface noise that you would hear on the disc was created by the deteriorating palmitic acid. At the same time, you have to choose the best stylus match, you have to possibly center the disc, and you have to choose the best playback curve. You also have to determine the groove width. There are two ways to do that. One is scientifically, which is using a microscope, and the other is using rears. The problem with using a microscope, you think, oh, it's perfect. You just look at it, and you see the size, and you get the stylus that matches that size. And that should work every time, and it works only sometimes. And that's because sometimes the groove is worn, and you want to hit a spot of the groove where there is no wear. Now, if you're trying to reproduce a disc, do you reproduce the disc the way it sounds best, or do you reproduce the disc in order to preserve what's on it? And the answer is yes. Ideally, you'd do both. You'd make an original recording in which you produce literally everything that's on the disc, including all the flaws. But you also want it to sound as good as we can do with the technology today. For one thing, Rodgers and Hammerstein has great experts, like Jeff Willens, who can go there and make a recording sound as good as he can. And perhaps in the future, there won't be such people who have this knowledge and this skill.